Hi, I'm Lisa Logan. I'm glad you're joining me today for another episode of Parents of Patriots. If you watched the entire Sinister SEL series, you may have been wondering how we got to a place in education where schools are tracking what students are thinking and feeling and scoring such subjective skills in the first place. I'm glad you asked. In this series, The Transformation of Education, I'll address the internal and external forces that are bent on radically shifting the way that schools measure accountability.
Social-emotional learning initiatives come into states and school districts in various ways, mostly through the ones listed here. I'll eventually cover all of these in this series, but I want to dive into some particular areas that are likely affecting your state the most and being talked about the least. Let's start with ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. ESSA was signed into law in 2015 and replaced the previous education law called No Child Left Behind. ESSA laid out expectations of transparency for parents and communities, requiring every state to measure performance in reading, math, and science, and to develop an easily accessible online state report card that reports on the test results in those areas. The report cards must also provide data on graduation rates, suspensions, absenteeism, teacher qualifications, and many other areas. ESSA has been explained as a significant improvement over No Child Left Behind in the areas of federal overreach into education, specifically regarding standards, testing, and accountability measures. In comparing the language between the two bills, this assertion is incorrect. While ESSA got rid of the adequate yearly progress measurement, it required that the Secretary of Education and a peer-reviewed committee must approve state plans that may include non-academic and subjective factors that measure student engagement or school climate and safety. To understand states' shift to measuring and reporting on non-academic factors, you have to understand how the U.S. Department of Ed directs education in the states using a federal tripod of policies, which consists of standards, assessments, and accountability. Laws like the 1994 Improving America's Schools Act cracked the door for states accepting federal money, like Title I funds, to be held accountable to the federal government for their results, and laws like No Child Left Behind and ESSA blew it wide open. Here you can see the fundamental shifts this made in who decides what students should learn, how that learning is measured through assessments, and what states are required to report back to the federal government on. All of this led to more federal control of education, and in turn less local control. We went from states making their own standards to the federal government dictating what educational standards should be through initiatives like Common Core. States accepting federal money are then subjected to federal accountability, having not only to report on students' mastery of academic skills, but also non-academic skills. What you must report on, you must assess. So assessments were changed to measure academic skills as well as social-emotional skills. What you assess, you must teach, so curriculum now included instruction on social-emotional skills, which was embedded into curriculum to meet Common Core standards. How students' progress was measured had to shift from being qualitative to quantitative. Outcomes had to be concretely measurable as a number and tracked over time with the ability for it to follow the child, like a digital data backpack, not just through their educational career, but across schools and state lines. In order to achieve this, statewide longitudinal data systems that were built to house all the data being collected were expanded into interoperable data systems that were able to communicate across states. All of the aforementioned changes gave rise to digital learning and assessment tools that gave big tech and big data more control over what kids are learning, how it's being measured, and the massive amounts of information being collected on students. Not only were changes made at the federal level, but my own state passed certain laws and accepted certain grant money that laid the groundwork and incentivized Utah schools to pilot CBE programs. These programs aim to shift the education accountability system away from tracking knowledge of core academic subjects through merit-based grading and into soft skills-focused, competency-based education. This is basically the rebranding of outcomes-based education, which is the older, failed sibling of CBE that I discussed in part 1 of my Sinister SEL series. And then House Bill 181 changed all the code related to competency-based education by adding the word personalized. Utah's approved American Rescue Plan relief funds application even included a proposal to use $300,000 to transform accountability to support personalized competency-based learning, as well as $250,000 for a demonstrated competency assessment. Here are some questions for you to ask yourself about this new experimental model of systems accountability that is a radical departure from the traditional model we've been doing for centuries. One of the key drivers of personalized competency-based learning, or PCBL, is the company KnowledgeWorks, who was also involved in the competency-based education policies in Race to the Top and Common Core, as well as the 2015 Every Student Succeeds Act. Since 2006, KnowledgeWorks has been creating forecasts on where they believe learning is headed, addressing what they think are foundational issues on the horizon, and then use those reports to generate strategies for K-12 schools, informal and community-based learning organizations, as well as higher education institutions. Various states have contracted with KnowledgeWorks to build out what competencies their state should focus on as they look to that future. My own state of Utah has done just that. At the release of their new framework for identifying the key characteristics of a Utah graduate, the USBE said that they recognized that it wasn't enough to just develop the Portrait of a Graduate document, but instead they were going to need to develop competencies in alignment with the 13 categories of focus the document laid out. You're just going to have to ignore this part here in the document that says that these are aspirations not necessarily meant to be quantified and measured. Nevertheless, the USBE contracted with KnowledgeWorks in 2020 to build those out, with the expectation that these competencies are meant to follow the student from preschool to age 20, or P20, as they move through the K-12 system and into higher education. This was also an extension of the competency-based education pilot that the USBE developed with the help of the company ExcelinEd. Now, the USBE claims that Portrait of a Graduate is not an outside program, but was simply a process for schools to determine the knowledge and skills they want their students to obtain to be successful post-secondary. Portrait of a Graduate is a national program created by an Ohio-based, Gates-funded company called Battelle for Kids. They brought onto their company EdLeader 21, a national network of school systems across the nation committed to what they call 21st century learning, and also Partnership for 21st Century Learning, or P21, who were early pioneers of this movement. The push to get states to shift their policies to adopt the P21 framework is billed as a way to prepare students for college and career readiness. In reality, the 21st Century Skills Initiative is seen as yet another way to advance the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, specifically SDG 4, Quality and Inclusive Education for All. Global Partnership for Education, who you may remember from this chart from the Sinister SEL series, mentioned Partnership for 21st Learning, or P21, and CASEL in this document as working to take a systems approach to 21CS, an international education focus from UN agencies to target skills needed to advance their Education 2030 agenda. So Portrait of a Graduate is really not a local initiative, and it's being used to fundamentally transform the purpose of U.S. education by shifting curriculum, assessments, school accountability, and data collection away from prioritizing academics and instead towards social-emotional skills through personalized competency-based learning. It's not just happening in Utah either. Many states are adopting these frameworks and initiatives, and KnowledgeWorks is even tracking bills which help that mission along. Another reason KnowledgeWorks gives for supporting this radical transformation in school accountability is that tracking student progress through merit-based grading is racist and a tool of the colonizer. They view personalized competency-based learning and education built around social, emotional, or emotional intelligence as a stepping stone toward liberatory education. If you don't know what that is, think of it this way. Just as social emotional learning was embedded into Common Core academic standards, subjects, and assessments, liberatory education will infuse critical theory into everything. Doesn't that sound nice? In their Imagining Liberatory Education Futures forecast, one of the 4 projected scenarios KnowledgeWorks paints is a picture where there is low responsiveness to systems change in both public institutions and society where liberatory education thrives in microschools. They say, quote, "While some schools have implemented project-based learning or personalized competency-based learning, states and districts remain heavily divided on the extent to which curricula are culturally responsive and school cultures are anti-racist. Schools are more equitable than in the past, but they are not liberatory. Many states continue to dismiss acknowledgement of systemic racism as a political talking point. In other states, whitewashed versions of African American history and culturally relevant pedagogies are taught. Many public schools are simply not willing to devote the time and energy to work through the discomfort and challenges of becoming anti-racist. In contrast, education liberation commons are inherently rooted in multiple ways of knowing, diverse forms of knowledge, and culturally responsive curricula. KnowledgeWorks mentions marginalized groups in this scenario, fleeing public education and turning to microschools. Some microschools, fueled and funded by school choice initiatives, have already made themselves the testing ground for this liberatory education model. School choice programs, like the Koch and Walton Family Foundation funded 4.0 schools, which launched with the school choice initiative Yes Every Kid, are built toward that end. Here, 4.0 Schools explains that their Angel Syndicate is a 6-month program and giving circle for Black leaders looking to build collective power as education philanthropists. They say this is needed because philanthropy is too white, and they want to build a new model to shift power away from that to make things more equitable. Just read 4.0's playbook, and you'll see that their goal through school choice initiatives is the decentralization and eventual dismantling of the public education system while transferring power and control to themselves. You might find it interesting that the same money stream funding 4.0 schools, the Koch-funded Stand Together, also funds orgs like Americans for Prosperity, who help support other school choice initiatives like the Hope Scholarship here in Utah. The Hope Scholarship would have provided education savings accounts through a scholarship granting organization for families to use toward educational expenses such as homeschool costs, tutoring, education pods, online programs, private schools, etc. While having the money follow the student sounds wonderful, it also has many pitfalls. Remember the federal tripod of control, the ESSA requirements, and the data backpack I talked about earlier? Well, unfortunately, that follows the student too. While the bill promised educational freedom and choice, there were also many strings attached. The Utah State Board of Ed could require audits and normative assessments that in time would have brought in all sorts of regulatory measures into, say, for instance, homeschool curriculum. The Utah Supreme Court has declared that the Utah State Board of Ed has plenary powers over all public education, and I have no doubt that they would have flexed that muscle in this scholarship program to bring in all sorts of equity and DEI regulations. I would question any ESSA legislation trying to be passed that doesn't acknowledge or openly and honestly address these types of issues in their messaging and in their bills to protect long-term educational choice. I feel for parents of children that are in a bad education situation with not many good options. I get it. My single mom worked 2 jobs to be able to afford to send me to a private high school just so I didn't have to go to the one down the street that always had gangs and drive-by shootings. Maybe one day we can get to a point where people's tax dollars remain theirs to educate their kid with as they wish without any strings attached, but with the way our education system is set up right now, it would be a move we would regret later. And if we bring that government money into the homeschool arena, things might be good for a few years, and then the regulations will come. California can attest to that. One thing's for sure, a decentralized education structure doesn't necessarily mean decentralized power. We don't want to create a future where no child will be able to escape the indoctrination because there are no bastions of educational freedom left. We must protect our private schools and especially our homeschools from government intrusion through government funding and also push back against the radical shift toward personalized competency-based learning in our states.
School choice initiatives and personalized competency-based learning work hand in glove. The grade fluid, learn anytime, anywhere accountability system of PCBL and being able to check off competencies versus earn grades work well in the micro-school model of school choice. Either way, the goal of both is to decentralize the school system and do away with local school boards and eventually brick-and-mortar schools altogether. With PCBL comes more digital learning, and not all students learn best that way. Teachers will become mere facilitators as children learn their competencies through a playlist education on a computer. They deserve to learn in a room with other students in front of a human teacher who cares about them. What they bill as a personalized education designed to prepare students for the workforce of the future will actually take away their individuality, their freedom, and their autonomy as students are pigeonholed into particular jobs. Don't fall for the fluffy language and the curated talking points. Personalized competency-based learning and the movement for school choice has a dark side. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.